So we're making good progress here with this demo app, and we'll soon switch to another demo app. But before we do that, there's one other HTMX feature you should know about because it can further simplify your code and come in handy in certain situations. Some of these attributes, like hxTarget for example, but also hxSwap, accept extra configuration settings, you could say. And we'll take a look at the extra settings you can make to hxSwap a little bit later. For the moment, I want to focus on hxTarget instead. Because hxTarget, as you learned, takes such a CSS selector to select the target element in the currently active page, in the currently rendered DOM, that should be replaced with the response content. However, what's important to note here is that you're not limited to specifying such a CSS selector. It might be what you do in most scenarios, but it's not the only thing you can do. Instead, you can, for example, also use the special this keyword here as a value for hxTarget. And this simply tells HTMX that it's the element on which this attribute was placed that should be replaced with the response content. And that actually is the default of hxTarget, so you typically don't need to set that. You could just omit hxTarget instead, but nonetheless it's worth knowing about this. More useful is another variation of this hxTarget value though, because you can actually also use some commands here in hxTarget. And that's a feature that will come in handy with the hxTarget usage on this remove button. Because here I'm targeting the list item that should be removed with the ID. So with this ID that was assigned to that list item. Now that works, but we could also use the closest command and then use a simpler CSS selector like the list item tag selector to target the closest list item seen relative from this button. If we would just use list item, we would select the first list item on the entire page, which is not necessarily the list item we want to delete. But if we use the closest command in front of this CSS selector, we actually select the closest list item relative from this button. And this doesn't have to be a tag selector here. This could be anything, also some ID selector. But by using closest li, we now actually no longer need to assign such an ID to this list item, and we can get rid of that code therefore. And hence we overall simplified this HTML code. And closest isn't the only command you can use here. If you take a look at the hxTarget documentation, you see that you could also use find in front of a CSS selector, for example, to find a child element, the first child element with that CSS selector inside of the element on which the hxTarget attribute was placed. You could also just use the next command without any CSS selector to simply select the next sibling after the element on which hxTarget was placed, and so on. So you have these extra commands, closest, find, next, and so on, to control which exact element should be selected. And this sometimes allows you to write simpler code than you would have to write without these commands. Like here, where we were able to get rid of that unnecessary goal ID in the end. And therefore here, if we save these changes, I can still click remove and it's still the right item that is removed, but now we actually achieved that with leaner and simpler code.